Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and video show which brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience and wisdom from hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe so you won't miss a new episode. I'm your host, Frits Bussemaker, and today I'm delighted and privileged to have a conversation with Leif Edvinsson. Leif, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Leif, I'm going to briefly introduce you to the audience, and then we'll talk about your background more extensively. You are the world's first director of intellectual capital in Scania,
Yep.
the world's first holder of professorship on intellectual capital, again in Sweden. Now you have a number of professorships around the world. You also have been appointed Brain of the Year. Now that makes me very curious, specifically because you won that prize with the recipient when also Bill Gates and Paul McCartney were awarded. So you beat Bill Gates, you beat Paul McCartney, and you're listed as one of the 50 most influential thinkers in the world. So very honored that you are on our show, on The Brand Called You. And let me start off with a very first question, obvious question. What's intellectual capital and how did you become the world's first director?
Thank you for the question, and I look forward to have a chat with you about various dimensions of it. It's still a subject in evolution. Even if it has been going on for some decades now. Well, it started with that I was recruited by Scandia to support their development. And then one of the early observations was that there was so much value in the enterprise that was not visible. So one of the first things we did was to make a video for the employees to show what we had. And they were extremely curious to learn more. So that was a learning process of having a video to visualize the hidden values of the enterprise. At that time, we had some 12,000 employees around the world, probably around 15, 20 countries. So the question was, where is our intellectual capital?
Okay.
Is it on the desk in the computer, or where is it? And we're still searching.
Okay. By the way, if that capital, that knowledge is hidden, who was the brilliant person how did somebody recognize that, hey, we've got something hidden and we need to expose and find that?
It was probably in a conversation that I participated in with the CEO of that time, who was very, very humble and smart and had a background in the financial sector. So he was very well acquainted with the accounting and assessment of it. And Scandia was growing very rapidly at that time as well. So there was a lot of challenges to present the value of the organization for various stakeholders.
Okay. Could you give me a definition of what intellectual capital is?
There are several definitions. One is it is the roots of the fruit tree. So that's why you have to turn the tree upside down to see it. The roots for the fruits. And it also gives you a priority, what to focus. And some traditional accountants were focusing on reducing the cost by cutting the roots, but that doesn't give you the fruits of tomorrow. So implicitly in that little observation is that the most important is not the fruits of yesterday, but the fruits of tomorrow, which means that you have to develop the metrics and the mapping of the hidden values. And the distinction of it is there are still some people are trying to find the ultimate definition, but I call it distinction instead. So you start to realize that there are hidden values. There is ways to visualize them. And that's why we started with this little video of illustrating that there are things that you probably didn't know and you hadn't seen. And that influenced the Securities and Exchange Commission in US to start to work on the assessment of hidden values in enterprises. Because if you hide values in a stock listed company, that is a fraud in US with big penalties. So that's why it's so important to visualize the hidden values if you are courage enough.
Okay.
Otherwise, you are developing hidden values, and that is illegal.
Okay. Can you give a concrete example of what an example of intellectual capital and how you can visualize that then?
Well, one very simple one is to visualize the number of customers to Spotify, because you don't know them and you register them as nodes in a network, and that those nodes are extremely valuable. And it's the same with an insurance, as we were an insurance company. You don't know that you need the insurance until it might be too late. So that's why the whole insurance business is about hedging a value, fire or something like that, or accident, to prepare for tomorrow in a smarter way. The meaning of intellectual capital from a word viewpoint is derived insights of hidden value.
Okay.
Derived insights of hidden value. And the derived insights is basically the intellectual dimension. The hidden value might be the tangible part of it, of an intellectual property or an intellectual asset or a knowledge recipe. And that's why you have a whole tree of distinctions, whether you're talking about the patent, the software, or a trademark.
Okay. Word which comes to mind is the word fuzzy. Fuzzy when it comes, if you describe intellectual capital and you want to put a boundary behind it to make it very concrete. I was just wondering, can you do that? Somehow it seems that there's going to be a gray area, or there's going to be, room to maneuver in what it is and what it isn't.
And that's why Securities and Exchange Commission was very eager to visualize it in an orderly manner. But that might be detrimental because it is probably a rosy area. You don't know where the future will take you. So therefore you have to manage the future. And then I started to develop the concept of the navigator, because you don't know if where you're moving, and then suddenly you are not coming to the place where you wanted to go. And that is navigation. And you probably recall the old story from the British Navy that tried to get back to the original harbor, but they couldn't. And the reason why they couldn't was because of the tide. And the tide took you off the sending point on the map. And this is also a very interesting dimension, and more interesting of today, because you're drifting off the value creation. And this off drift is perhaps the bearing power. You have to be on the edge. Otherwise, you're like in sailing, you might go totally wrong. And this is related to the rotation of the Earth. And perhaps you know the speed of rotation of the Earth. Do you have any mind?
Speed and rotation, to be honest, I don't know it, so I have to guess it, but I also know that it very much depends on your point of view, what the speed and rotation is.
Yes, which is a distinction issue.
Yeah.
But the traditional metrics indicate that it is in the neighborhood of 1600 kilometers per hour.
Yeah.
So you should, if perhaps, get the speed ticket. But most organizations are not following that speed. They are very slow in the rotation. And that's why we have this big subject of innovation of today.
Okay. If you could say somebody in management at an organization or an entrepreneur is listening in, my question on their behalf would be, who within an organization is responsible for intellectual capital?
Who is or was?
Was both?
Actually, it's everybody is in charge. Initially, it was the accountants. Now it has moved into the software domain, and it should probably go into the domain of culture and networks, because that's where you find the connections and the way of navigating together to stay on the edge.
Okay. When you talk about culture and networks, does that also mean that, suggesting that it also has a link with communication? So can you argue that the more you communicate, the higher your intellectual capital is, because you share knowledge?
If you can.
Yeah. Can you share knowledge? Can you transfer knowledge?
Well, it is very tricky. You can share information, but the knowledge, the aha, which is another distinction of intellectual capital, or the short for it, IC, is aha. And how do you transfer ahas?
Okay, so this reminds me of, you can take a horse to water, you can't make a drink, so you can provide all the data and knowledge you have, but if people don't understand it, don't accept it, then it's not turned into their own intellectual capital.
Exactly, very good summary. And this relates to, as we said just a few minutes ago, that the old distinction of, or the initial distinction of intellectual capital was about the cost for it. So what's the cost for your knowledge? Is it the same? And then if you then add the other dimension, your salary, if you're an employee, is your salary representative for your knowledge? Most likely not. So you're underpaid, and perhaps some are overpaid.
Yeah. Okay. Now, makes me curious. Somebody's going to knock on your door. Hey, look, I'm the CEO of organization X, and I want to assess what my current state of my intellectual capital is, and I want to improve. Where do you begin?
Usually I was starting with the numbers of people, and then taking the initial salary as a proxy for that those people who gave you a salary had some idea of it. But this is just the first indication, like your name, or therefore the more correct one is your value adding to the organization or society. And this value added is of course dynamic. It is a fraction of the total economy. It is perhaps something to aspire for rather than historical data. So you start to see that there are a number of inroads to get to it. But it's also interesting to see, research shows, for example, that if you have too much cost for the employees, then you are, this indicates that you are a vulnerable organization. because people might not come tomorrow. So there is a kind of risk or negative value in starting to work with the numbers as well. And this is extremely interesting. The first indication is if you have done a little bit of the homework, you got the tentative value. If more than 50% of that is human capital related, then you are at risk. And if you are on the stock exchange, you will be very volatile.
Okay. This also sounds to me like almost like an HR question, in the sense that any organization which takes good care of its staff, retains staff, helps, you could say, increase and sustain its own intellectual capital.
Yes, but then you're coming back to the distinction that the human capital is a risk factor in your enterprise. It's much more a risk than you ever thought of. And you can take Spotify as a case. Spotify has not very many, I think it's about 5,000 or something like that, employees, but they have millions of customers every day. So the value is not in the relationship between employees, it's the relationship in the network between customers. And that is called customer capital.
Interesting to think about, you could say. So it's, for me, it started off as a fuzzy topic, but glad you're giving it, you could say, you're putting meat on the bones. I'm starting to understand what intellectual capital is.
So then we are in the same league.
starting. Yeah. I'm not saying I'm catching up by far, no.
Yes. Very good questions.
Yeah. But Leif,
remember what we said just a few minutes ago, that the most important is the human dimension, not the human asset.
Yeah. Okay. Can you expand a little bit on that?
Yeah. If you start to regard an employee as an asset, then you might be drifting off in this rotation very quickly. And you get into a number of problems with the union and with the society, with the educational background, etc. So the best is actually to start to draw a map of relationships. And in that, you start to detect the culture of people in between. So that's another distinction of intellectual capital. It's the value in between, or connecting the dots, like Steve Jobs was indicating.
Interesting. We'll make certain that we include a couple of links to relevant websites so people can read more on intellectual capital and how they can assess that in their own organization. Leif, I want to ask you to end this very interesting discussion to talk a little bit about the Brain of the Year award. As mentioned in the introduction, that year you got you were the recipient. Also, Bill Gates, Paul McCartney were nominated. How does this happen, and what is this?
That's a very good question. I'm still searching for the answer. But one of the key navigators to work on this was at that time the CEO of the British intelligence, MI5. So they were searching for talents that should be rewarded for the new dimensions of navigating enterprises. And that, of course, goes for hospitals as well as companies. And I was on that list, and I was very honored and very curious to find out more about it. And then a key person in that was Tony Buzan. So he was together with the MI5 nominating people. And that, if you know Tony Buzan, the mind map guy, he came up with very, very interesting people. So I think today it's somewhere around 25 people in the world who are having this award profile. But it also goes back to what we touched upon earlier, that there is intellectual capital not only in enterprises, in societies. So if you take Amsterdam, for example, is it the same volume of intellectual capital in Amsterdam as in Dubai? And which one is, so to say, developing its intellectual capital as a society? And it might be that Amsterdam was very early in developing global maps for their travel. Today, it's some other nations who are the navigators of tomorrow. And that might be Middle East, especially UAE, because UAE has proclaimed that they should be on the top of the list. And they said so more than 10 years ago. And during the last 10 years, it has increased its transportation capability. So if you just look at the airport of Dubai, it's extremely intelligent. And that implies that another dimension of intellectual capital is, of course, the IT development. So if you combine the navigation, the Earth rotation, the new metrics, and the leadership of being in that turmoil, and the rotation is 1,600 kilometers an hour, it's easy to perceive that nations fall off the list, which might be the case for Sweden.
Yeah. Okay. It's an interesting way to also get a global perspective where intellectual capital, you could say, is growing and declining. Now, may I assume that the Brain of the Year award, was that a milestone in your career, or what were other milestones?
There were some other milestones. The first one was probably when I got the scholarship to go to Berkeley in California. And I was very happy, and I learned to think there. So I say to my colleagues in Lund that I'm educated at University of Lund in Sweden, but I learned to think in California. And that, Fritz, leads to the question to you. Where did you learn to think?
Actually, I think I went to Delft University, where I learned to think about how to solve problems, how to tinker with things. But I've learned to apply that just by working over the years. So it's just, I'm still learning in my experience.
Yes, and that leads to the schooling system, which I'm very interested in as well. So how do we learn our colleagues and friends and kids to think? In Berkeley, it was very obvious and very productive. When you were having the exams, you didn't get the scoring for replying to the question. You got the score for not replying to the question, and rather turn it around and see what's behind the question and how will it evolve when we proceed.
Yeah, I understand this as a milestone. Now, where do you get your inspiration from? How do you, what triggers your thought process?
The inspiration was probably coming very much from the context and the culture of Berkeley, because the whole educational program of that university was very different from the Swedish one, which is more German in it, or was more German in its development. Then the next critical dimension was probably the traveling and being in different cultures. For the moment, I have just passed around 100 countries in the world. And of course, that is a great inspiration. The third part of this inspiration is a kind of implicit softer dimension, like they call it in France, soft knowledge. And that is, how do you make society more innovative, not for you, but for next generation?
Good points. Hey, final
Yes,
question, Leif. How do you want the world to remember you? What's your legacy?
a curious one.
Be curious.
Yes, to see what's around the corner.
Be
And that was
curious.
be curious, and that was emerging among others in California as well as in Scandia. We were constantly searching for what's around the corner, which is obvious when you're in the insurance sector. Is it a risk or is it an opportunity? And then we also learned from physics that the biggest space for the future is zero.
So that's good advice to anybody out there as well. Because remain curious, young and old, and you can grow your own intellectual capital.
Yes, and it's worth much more than gold.
Good point. Hey, Leif, again, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, insights in what's intellectual capital and how you can apply it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And we have probably developed some intellectual capital in between us during this conversation. And it's very much based on your questions. That's why we also developed, together with a colleague at University of Lund, the Quizzics, the art and science of questioning.
That's going to be a topic for a future interview. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.